From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and concerned citizens making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melithopoulos, Assistant Professor in Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. Now, everybody's heard that mason bees are amazing pollinators of spring fruit trees. We heard in a previous episode with Carolyn Brees from the OSU Apiculture Lab that mason bees are a good alternative if you don't want to invest in the time and skill required to manage a honeybee colony. But what about using a mason bee nest to really uncover the secrets of native bee biology or as an educational tool for youth or the general public? Well, my next guest is a real pro at both those things. Ron Spendal is an OSU Extension Master Gardener in Washington County. Many of you in the Portland area have no doubt taken his Mason Bee 101 course or seen him on Oregon Field Guide, on Oregon Public Broadcasting. He is a real expert on mason bees because he's made intensely detailed observations on their nesting behavior. We're going to hear about how he does this in this episode. He's also going to give us an update of how mason bees did this year. Their nesting period is almost over, and also some of the amazing outreach and education tools that he's developed over the years. I'm really excited to bring this episode to you. It's been a long time coming. So here's Ron Spendal. All right. So welcome to Pollination, Ron. Finally.
Thank you. Yeah, we've been talking about it for quite a while.
You're probably one of the first. You were there actually when I was hired. You were when I showed up to OSU on the very first day. Ron Spendal was there to meet me.
Yeah, I was part of your interview panel.
Well, so many years later, finally got you on the show, and I guess one thing that right now mason bees are still active. They're still building nests. How are they doing this year? I know it's been a funny year for everybody because of the stay-at-home order. But what have you noticed about mason bees? What's your experience been this year?
Well, I've got 13 research sites across western Washington County, and only one of the sites am I monitoring every day at the same time every day. And this year, at that one site is Jackson Bottom Wetlands, and this year is much better than last year, actually. Last year I ended up collecting about 906 cocoons from Jackson Bottom, and so far this year I've gotten 2,878 nesting cells as of 1 o'clock this afternoon.
Do you have any sense of what happened last year? I know last year was a poor return where you were, and were you ever able to figure out what happened?
Most of it I would attribute to a cool, wet spring going into it, heavy on the wet side. This year, it's been a cooler spring than historical for the time period, but much drier. I've only been soaked twice since April 1st when I started doing the daily routine. So it's not too bad.
Where are we? We're recording this May 1st. How far along in the cycle are your bees?
Basically, they are cycling out. I think today I had 13 new nesting cells built, and that's all. So it's on a very steep decline. So the big time consumer right now when I'm doing my daily monitoring is trying to determine when the eggs are actually hatching into larvae. So that takes a lot of manipulation on my part. Frequently in the nesting cell, you won't even be able to see the egg because the female smudged the plexiglass cover on the tray with some nectar and pollen, and you can't see anything beneath of it. But frequently, if you stare at it at funny angles and kind of stand on your head, you can see the egg in there. And even though it may not be totally obvious, you can kind of manipulate things around where you can see it. Sometimes it's very clear. At Jackson Bottom Wetlands, for example, I have 53 nesting trays, all of which each one has a clear plexiglass lid on it. So I'm able to see the nesting as it develops through the whole season, for the most part. There are still some mason bees out and about, doing a lot of foraging and stuff, but nesting cell development right now is going really slow. At the beginning of the period, back towards the 1st of April, it was going very fast. There were a number of days where frequently a female mason bee would lay up to 4 eggs a day.
Is that right?
Which is really a lot of work.
And when just to complete the timeline, when did your cocoons go out this year?
I put the cocoons out basically about the last week of March, third to fourth week of March.
Is that the earliest that you've put cocoons out?
No, I put them out as early as Valentine's Day, and then just waited to see what would happen.
Huh.
I've done different approaches. Sometimes I'll set them out early, like I used to, but around Valentine's Day, and then wait just to see, how Mother Nature would warm up. And when it got above 55 degrees for enough days in a row, they would start to emerge from their cocoons. But then frequently the pollen and nectar resources weren't at the right stage. Even though they were emerging, there was nothing really for them to forage on. So now I've gotten to the point where I refrigerate my cocoons and wait for the pollen and nectar resources to show up. And once I'm convinced that they are, in fact, abundant in the environment, then I'll set the cocoons out of the cooler. And within 24 hours, they're pretty much, ambient temperature and everything kicks into gear. So I'm much more in control of when they emerge from their cocoons this way.
Well,
and at Jackson Bottom, they have a large banks of flowering currants and Oregon grape. And Oregon grape is kind of the plant that I use to gauge things by. When it's, busting open, I know it's fine, and then the mason bees really like Oregon grape, so then I'll set the cocoons out and things will take off.
Okay, fantastic. I do want to. You do things in a very, and I think listeners who are listening to you, like, I know that those are all kind of peculiar practices. Clear plexiglass, watching eggs, like these are these are peculiarities to you, because for you, mason bees are not what a lot of people have mason bees for, to pollinate some kind of backyard fruit tree. Or for you, mason bees are a whole lot more. And in the interview, I'd like to kind of get into all those things that they are for you. But one of the things they are is a intensive research project. You've been looking at mason bees for a long time. Tell us a little bit about what your mason bee blocks look like, because they themselves seem to be key to what you do, and they're peculiar.
Okay. That's an opinion, and I can respect that. To me, they're not peculiar, but basically when I got into mason bees, which was back in 2004, I did a lot of reading on mason bees and attended a lecture and went through the normal route that a lot of people go through. And most people were talking about holes drilled in blocks of wood and paper straws. And I tried that, and they did work. Mason bees nested in the straws. They nested in the bee traps. But it was, to me, kind of a failed attempt to understand more about the bee, because everything it was doing was done where I couldn't see them. I wanted to know what they were doing in those straws and what they were doing in the drilled holes and everything. And so I was researching different tray designs and trying out different things. And I even tried clear plexiglass tubes that I would cut and put a cork in one end and watch the mason bees nest in those a little bit. But again, when they started nesting, they're carrying a lot of pollen and nectar, and they got smudged, and it was hard to see. So that didn't work out very well for me, but it worked out better than the paper straws. And then I thought, well, if I did wooden trays, I could put plexiglass over the top of it and really get a good picture of what's going on. And then I experimented with what the channels could look like. I did it where the channels were pretty much rounded when you put one tray on top of the other. I did it where the channel had a rounded bottom but straight sides and a flat plexiglass lid across the top. And tried different designs on the trays and figured out that basically the bees didn't care what shape the dimension of the channel was, but the diameter of the channel was critical. It needed to be 5/16 of an inch, because I made trays with different diameter channels ranging from 1/8 of an inch up to 1/2 inch, and put 20 of those kinds of variable size trays out across different sites in Washington County, and 87% of the time, the mason bee used the 5/16 of an inch channel, as opposed to the other options that were available to it.
I remember that was one of the first things I noticed about work that you were doing, was a very nice kind of description of common bees, cavity nesting bees, and their cavity preferences, which I thought was really elegant. I hadn't seen anybody kind of do that in an area.
Yeah, and it gave me an opportunity that I didn't anticipate, which is when I put out the variable size channel trays. I could see where the mason bees were nesting, but then as I left the trays out, other native pollinators would come and make use of the smaller size channels, even down to 1/8 of an inch. I was getting Pasilicus wasps nesting in there, which are very, very tiny black wasps that prey on aphids. And they were so small that when they went into the 1/8 inch channel, they even got tree sap and made the entry only 1/16 of an inch. So it would prevent anything larger than themselves to get in. So they were very protective of their environment. But that way I got to see, I think I ended up with a total of about 12 different native pollinators, and a few different kinds of wasps that were out there.
Okay, so you ended up with a design. You through experimentation, you came up with a design that finally got you where straws and wooden blocks wouldn't get you. You could see everything, well, apart from some smudges that were going on in the mason bee nest. Why was that? What did you have in mind at the time? Because you've done many, many experiments since that time. What was the kind of first questions that you had when you could finally peer inside the nest and see what they were doing?
I was curious as to what things they did first. Did they always build a mud wall at the end of the channel, which some books said they would initially go back and build a back wall and then proceed to make nesting cells as they exited the channel. And sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. I can't remember what this percentage was of time. It was a high percentage where they did always, not always, but they usually put a back wall in. And other things would happen that I would find curious, so I needed to do more research to figure out why that was happening. For example, in a wooden tray with a plastic lid on it, plexiglass lid, the bee can still perceive that there is a opening or a minuscule crack between the top of the wood and the plexiglass. So frequently, like in the mid 90% of the time, the mason bee will caulk that crack that it perceives. So I was looking at that, and then looking at straws, and when I would carefully unroll the straw, the only mud used was for the partition between the nesting cells. it was a wafer thin little disc of mud. And if you look at the nesting tray that I'd built, there would be the dividers in between the nesting cells, but also two lines of caulking at the top where it sealed up the crack between the wood and the plexiglass. So I had to weigh how much mud was within each cell given a straw as opposed to a wooden tray. And it's the mason bee has to use 240% more mud in my wooden trays because they do that caulking along those edges in there, which means my bees spend a lot more time collecting mud than mason bee nesting at a straw.
You know, I hate to do it. You know how there's this theory out there that retention of mason bees has to do with a number of factors, one of them being mud availability. It just struck me as you were saying that if it takes a lot less mud to do a straw, if retention would be higher. Do you know that? I'll just tell the listeners, this is what happens if you're from Washington County or anywhere on Portland. If you have a question about mason bees, you will ask it to Ron, and he has likely done the experiment to answer it. So, Ron, what do you think?
There may be that may be true. There are definite advantages to straws. I will not debate that. When I put out straws next to the wooden trays, I made a series of 6-inch long wooden trays with 5 channels routed in them, and 6-inch paper straws. And you put them side by side, and the bees will fill up the straws first. Every time. And then they'll go to the wooden tray and fill it up. But their first preference is the straw. And I would assume that would be because it is much more efficient for them to nest in that.
Okay.
They can use a lot less mud to make the divisions between the nesting cells and all of that.
Anyways,
but again, you just can't see what they're doing in there.
That's right. So I interrupted you. One of the first questions that you see, one of them was just basically watching the nesting behavior, and you started to generate new questions and that led you to make this. For example, subsequently you did an experiment where you looked at the mud effort that was required in different size chambers. What are some of the other questions that you've sort of posed using these really great observation mason bee blocks that you run?
Well, I'm kind of a natural skeptic, so even though I read as much as I can on mason bees in different books in the literature, they will make a statement in the book that I will say, well, is that really true? Here. They may have done some research. It could have been in Arizona in 120-degree heat, but not in Washington County, Oregon. So, for example, I wanted to see how many nesting cells in a 6-inch tray were going to be females, and were they always located deeper in the channel, and then the males out towards the front of the channel. And in fact, that was true. Whether or not, well, that led me then to think, well, why am I only doing 6-inch long trays? Why is 6 inches considered what everybody has? At that time, if you went online to look at nesting trays, everything was 6 inches long. All of the companies were selling 6-inch long straws. And I couldn't figure out why 6 inches was such a magical number.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody could really explain that very clearly. And that led me to calling some well-respected entomologists like Jim Kane at the USDA Bee Lab in Logan, Utah, and talking with them about why 6 inches, why 6 inches. And then I decided to make longer trays. And with the mason bees nest in channels longer than 6 inches. So I made wooden trays that were 2 feet long. The channels were 2 feet long. And then I did them at 24 inches, 22, 20, and then just worked backwards by two inches at a time, and sat out piles of these trays. And basically, the mason bees can pretty effectively nest up to 12 inches. Anything longer than 12 inches is kind of wasted effort on their part because it's just a lot of distance for them to have to cover. So they like basically 12 inches would be the maximum. So any kind of a tray between 6 inches and 12 inches seemed to be the ones that they were using in terms of the volume of nesting going on. So all of my trays now, except for a handful of experimental 6-inch trays that I keep, all of my trays now are 12 inches long, which makes the channel about 11 and a half inches deep. And so that leads to other experiments you can run. For example, a lot of the literature says that you'll probably get 1.5 to 2 males per female in a 6-inch straw, which I found to be true when I was looking at my 6-inch straws and opening them up and sexing the cocoons that were inside. But in a 12-inch long tray, again, they make the last, 4, maybe 5 cells in the channel will be males, but then they have a longer channel behind that they can basically construct female nesting cells. So,
it does remind me, we had a previous episode with Weldon Hobbs who was talking about the emergence of the leaf-cutting bee industry, alfalfa leaf-cutting bee industry. And I always wondered why are I think they're 4 inches in depth. And he said, there's a reason for that, is because they moved to plastic. And if you made them any longer, you couldn't dry the cocoons down. And it was like you inherit these things, you never quite understand why they were the way they were. You might assume a 4-inch depth is optimal. And the other part of it is research done in a faraway place which may not even apply. And so you have these received wisdoms that you just keep doing when you don't know. There are all these things that you never test. And I guess these blocks have enabled you to test a lot of these critical aspects of things like development. That we were talking just before we got on the episode. You've been have a long-standing interest in the development time of the bees.
Different pieces of literature that are available will tell you. Some studies will just say it's a short period of time between the date the egg is laid and the date that the egg hatches into a larva. Others will give you a specific number of days, and there's a wide variation. One of the things that a lot of the literature doesn't lay out in specifics for you is exactly where was the research done, what was the average temperature during the research period, what was the humidity, those kinds of things. So you can't really exactly replicate it, which is why, being a natural skeptic, I tend to run a lot of the experiments of literature that I've read to see if that holds true for our area. And I'm finding that there are significant differences. Basically, in 2019, I studied 1,005 eggs, and on average, they would hatch into a larva after 10 days. This year, so far, I've looked at about 1,500 eggs that have hatched, and they're at about 12 and a half days.
Really?
So I'm assuming that the difference in that time may be related to temperature and humidity. And I got weather channel places I can go to and look at, historical trends and patterns. And I'll do that to see, in fact, if there were significant differences between last year and this year during the same time frame, to see if that was the factor. Off the top of my head, that makes logic to me.
Yeah, these are. I do think these things are critical because it seems a lot of the times. I mean, with mason bees, everything seems a mystery to people who are managing them. why did they do this? Why did they do that? And people do come up with stories as to why they do things, but nobody ever really sets up the test.
Yeah, there's a lot of folklore, which I find interesting at times. When I first started really getting into mason bees, I would talk to people that have been raising mason bees for decades and ask them, what do they do? And look at what they're doing and then go out and visit their sites. And, some of them will take a nesting tray, and with a Sharpie, put little geometric symbols in front of the channels, like a square or a circle or a triangle. And they think that helps the bee navigate to the channel, that they can memorize that their channel is the circular, has a circle at the bottom of it. So that helps them figure out which channel is theirs. Basically, they mark their channels with a pheromone that they emit, so that each female has her own pheromone. Oh. And that's what she goes to. But there is a learning curve to it. At Jackson Bottom, for example, I have 4 nesting stations that are 10 feet apart from each other in a row. The stations are identical. And inside each station, there's 4 stacks of 3 trays. So they all look identical. And at the beginning of the season, you can watch the females come flying back. Sometimes they land in the wrong station. And then they'll walk around. They can't pick up their scent, so they fly to the station that's to the left of that one or to the right of that one. And they'll walk around until they pick up their scent and figure it out. And then if you kind of go back and sit and watch for hours, you can see the same female can now recognize which station to go to, and she'll fly to that station. And then she'll learn which stack of 3 she needs to locate, upper left, lower right, or whatever. And then eventually, after about a week to a week and a half, she will come flying directly into her channel. She won't stop and do any kind of checking out of any other landmark or anything. She knows exactly where she's going to. So navigation is a learned activity or a learned process for them. And I would love to figure out how to measure the rate of their learning navigational skills.
Well,
but that would take a lot of expensive camera equipment.
I suppose, but you never know. Let's get some bee tags on them.
Yeah.
The little paint marks.
Yeah.
Okay, well, yeah. I did want to ask you, I want to take a quick break, but before we take the break, what is it about this bee that you think sustains your interest? It seems like you have endless sets of questions. Is it this just that there's so little known, or its observability? Have you thought about why have you? And you have other interests. You've done a little bit of work with grass carrying wasps, but why this bee? Why is this bee really the center of your attention?
Basically because it's a solitary bee, and I'm a fairly solitary person, which I can relate to that. But the bee is different. As a kid, I would not have recognized it as a bee, and like most people, upon their first sight of a mason bee, would probably think it's a fly. But it just, to me, it's a creature that just has tremendous capabilities and skills and behaviors that I just want to keep learning more about. And the fact that it is so incredibly docile. During the peak of the nesting season, when I'm out doing my field studies and, picking up a stack of 3 trays and then looking through each tray and making my notes and everything, and the bees are foraging, and they're coming back and forth, and they're looking, and their tray's gone, and they see me, standing in front of the station, and I'm obviously in instruction. They ping me. I mean, they will fly and hit me and fly off and come back and hit me again, kind of tell me to hurry up and put the trays back. And frequently when I'm putting the trays back, they're still in my hand, and the bees are flying, on my arms and hands, trying to get into the right channel because they're in a hurry. And that, to me, it's just kind of a fascinating process that I can be so involved in what they're doing in terms of disrupting it to take my data and make my observations, and they seem to have extreme patience with me.
It's census time.
Yeah.
Well, let's take a quick break, and we'll come back. I want to ask you a few questions for people who are getting started. So we'll be right back.
Okay.
Okay, we're back. So you've mentored a lot of people on how to keep mason bees. How many people have you estimate that you've trained, and what are some of the most common problems that people have?
I have no idea how many people I've trained. I teach about 12 to 15 mason bee classes throughout the year.
Wow.
Mostly to adults, although I'm getting more and more involved in teaching in schools, elementary schools in particular. And it seems the people's concept about bees, and invariably when you go into a group of people, it doesn't matter if I'm talking to kids in the first grade or if I'm talking in front of a group of senior citizens. For a long, long time, I'd ask them to name 3 bees for me. And invariably, it was a honeybee, a bumblebee, and a yellow jacket.
Yeah.
And, you explain the yellow jackets are wasps, so you're really only naming 2 bees. And the 2 bees you're naming are highly social bees, and only 10% of the bee species in the world are social bees. But it never ceases to amaze me that our limited knowledge of bees is really only information about the minority of bees. Most of the bees, the 90% of bees that are solitary bees, are just mysteries to people. And they, as you explain some of the mystery to them, they seem to become more and more interested in what's going on. In particular, when you take care to explain that social bees live in hives, and if you live in a hive, you have an extremely high defense instinct and a fairly low survival instinct. And if you're a solitary bee, you're just the opposite. You have a very low defense instinct and an extremely high survival instinct. So working around solitary bees is a really safe activity. Mm-hmm. They're not going to sting you. They'll just fly away.
So is that one of the first things you run into people? They're just skittish? Like when you're getting into mason bee, you've got to deal with their skittishness?
Yeah. And I've developed an observational nesting station where the trays are vertical, and all you have to do is walk up to a nesting station and slide a door back, and you can see the nesting activity. You can get within a half inch of it.
You send me images. Where is it located? So can people go view this? It's quite remarkable.
Sure. There's a number of them at Jackson Bottom Wetlands here in Hillsboro. There's 2 of them on the campus at Portland Community College, the Rock Creek campus.
Okay.
And there's 1, and there will soon be 3 at Jenkins Estate in Beaverton. But basically, even though this is something that people can get so close to the bee to watch it, and the kids will get really, really close to it, when you're standing back and you're watching people and they don't know that you're involved with the mason bees, they are very skittish about using an observational tray. I mean, they see the bee coming in and they kind of, whoa, man, back up. I don't want to get stung. And then you kind of say, well, these are bees that won't sting you. They can, but they won't. It's not in their best interest. So, go ahead and just slide the door back and just, if they fly into their channel while you're looking, they'll do what they need to do and fly out. You can watch what they do. It's easy to calm people down once you explain it to them, but their initial skittishness is definitely there.
Okay, so after you kind of work through that part of it, what are some of the common problems? Where do people get hung up and lack success that you've observed over time? You must have people that come up to you and say, Ron, everything, it didn't work out at all. That must be a common thing you hear.
Yeah. Which led me to produce a lot of printed information that I try to hand out everywhere. But as you said, you give an hour presentation. People usually don't come and take a lot of notes. They're just there to listen, like at a nursery when you give a presentation and they're in the nursery and they'll sit down and listen to your presentation. But they'll miss critical things that to them may not sound that critical, like face your nesting station so it's somewhere between the east and the south. That usually flies right by them.
They put it in a shady spot that's convenient for them.
When you talk to them and they say, gee, I had terrible success, well, how did you set it up and which direction was it facing, and was there the three, critical elements that they need, pollen and nectar resource and a mud resource, and did you have the right kind of cavities for them to use, and did you clean them?
Well, let's back up on each one of those. So the first one is, I can imagine that somebody doesn't have a very good garden. There's not a lot of spring blooming plants, and they put the block out. They heard the shade thing, but the bees come out, and there's just nothing for them to go onto. I imagine must be a common issue.
It is, and so luckily, a lot of the nurseries up here that I do classes through have come up with lists of early flowering plants and shrubs that are attractant to native pollinators. So you kind of can point out to them that you need things like Oregon grape and flowering currants, Andromeda japonica, bluebills, some other kinds of things. So you can lay out what the flowering heather and flowering heath. You can lay out a kind of a list of things that people can start looking for. And if they don't have them in their immediate landscape for whatever reason, you can kind of say, well, look over your fence and see what your neighbors have, because they only forage for 300 feet. So if you can pretty much survey that football field around you, if there is foraging material in your neighbor's yard, you may be still successful in being able to raise mason bees, but you'll have to get them to come nest at your site. And one of the features of a mason bee is they like to nest close to where they emerge from their own cocoons. So if you've set out cocoons in your backyard and they emerge there, there's a very strong likelihood that that's where they will come and nest.
Well, the other thing that you mentioned as well, the second thing you mentioned is mud. Tell us a little bit about how somebody can make sure that there's enough mud for them.
Basically, Oregon, or Western Oregon at least, is blessed in that we have very clay-like soil. So it's the right kind of soil for a mason bee to use. They need a certain clay content to construct the nesting cell. But they like the mud resource to be as close as it can be to the nesting site, mostly because the mud weighs a lot. For them to fly with a ball of mud in between their jaws is a fairly difficult task. And the photos that I've been able to take of bees at a mud collection site, when they leave that site to fly back to the nesting station, they fly head down. Normally they fly a little bit heads up. So the weight of the mud is pretty significant in terms of their just ability to fly.
Huh.
But it's easy to provide the mud resource at a couple of the sites that I've got. I put the nesting station, I mount it to a 4x4 post that I've sunk in the ground, and I'll just take the post hole digger and go about 2 feet away and dig an 8-inch deep hole. And once a week, pour in a half gallon of water into the hole, and the mason bees will find that hole and go down into the hole to where the moisture level is the right moisture content, and they'll excavate caverns in the side of the hole
How
to get the mud out.
how wide does the hole have to be?
I just use a postal digger, so it's
That's
about
what I
5
wondered.
inches.
Okay.
It's about 5 inches wide.
All right.
The other thing that they like to use for a mud collection site is soil that's been recently uplifted, like a mole mound,
Uh-huh.
or cloud activity in a field nearby.
I got lots of
like
lots of moles.
Yeah, there you go. But I've put a couple of nesting stations in some community garden sites in the city of Hillsborough here. And they build their community gardens in usually poor land. And then they will come in, and what they did at this site at least, they put in like a 1/2-inch layer of cardboard, and then they put in like 4 or 5 inches of bark chips as a weed protector. And then they will make small raised beds and bring in used nursery soil to fill the raised beds so people can plant vegetables and whatever in those. And they wanted me to put in some nesting stations. But what I found was that, well, first of all, you got to get rid of the bark chips in an area, and that goes down 4 or 5 inches. And then there's a 1/2 inch of cardboard you have to get through. And then the soil underneath is usually real compacted or has a high gravel content, and didn't seem to be very good at all. So what I've done in a couple of these public garden places now is I will build a box that's 2 feet by 2 feet, and it's 2 feet tall. And at some of the sites that I use for my research are private farms, and so I asked the owner if I can just get a couple of buckets full of dirt from their field, and then I will go and fill up this 2 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot box that I built at a public garden. And the mason bees will use that for their mud source.
I'll be darned. Okay, the last thing you mentioned is cleaning. That the other place that people get jammed up on, you said the first thing is they put the boxes in the wrong place. They don't have spring blooming plants. They don't have. They may, if it's raised beds and it's a kind of like highly managed garden, they don't have mud resources. But the last thing you mentioned was they don't know how to clean, do the care on the box. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. Basically, if you're going to raise mason bees, there's certain responsibilities inherent in that activity, and one of which is keep them as clean as you can. So after they've cocooned, which is usually around the first week of June, into maybe mid-June, then you remove the nesting tray from the nesting station, or the straws if you're using straws, and you put them in like a paper bag or a large Tupperware box, and then you put that into an unheated storage shed, like a garden shed. You move it out of the environment basically because parasitic wasps show up about the 1st of June.
And just to describe, these are not wasps like people are used to wasps.
No, these are called monodontomerous wasps. They're only about 1/4 of an inch long, but they are very destructive when it comes to mason bees. They're very, very hard to see unless you're really looking for them. So it's not a typical wasp. So moving the cocoons into a protected area is one good step. And then around mid-November to the end of December, the mason bees are in a condition. Once they get inside their cocoon, they're kind of dormant. Some people say it's like hibernation, or it's called diapause. But in a 6 to 8 week window from usually mid-November to the end of December, they're in a condition called true diapause, which is where you can take the cocoon and put it in a warm environment, but the metabolic rate of the bee inside the cocoon won't increase because of exposure to warmth. So that gives you a period of time where you can bring the cocoons indoors and take them out of the straws or scoop them out of the channels in a nesting tray. And then you can clean the cocoons, which helps remove a lot of the mites that may have collected on the outside of the cocoon, the crombine mites. So that too helps clean the cocoons off. And then you can store the cocoons or put them in a cooler to be set out the following spring, so that then you've got clean cocoons that you put out. So when the bee emerges from the cocoon, it's not going to be covered with mites that are sitting there. And it's just a good process to do that cleaning
Describe
of
how
the cocoon itself.
Yeah, describe how the
then
cleaning takes place. Or finish the whole cycle, then come on back to the cleaning.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so after you clean the cocoon, then if it's a paper straw that you were using, you've unraveled the straw, so it's lost, and you'll have to buy new straws. If it's a wooden nesting tray that you've done, and you scoop the cocoons out and clean them, then you need to clean the tray out, which you can do quite easily. The channel that you've got is 5/16 of an inch wide, so I take a 1/4 of an inch wide strip of wood and wrap a piece of sandpaper around it, and then just run it up and down the channel a couple of times to knock out any mud that may still be in there, and then blow it out really good. If you're still concerned that there might be mites in the nesting tray, you can easily take care of that by freezing the trays.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've got cleaned wooden trays, then you want to make sure that there's no mites living in them. Just freeze the trays for like 24 to 48 hours, and that'll assure that they're mite free. And then reconstruct them when you put them back out.
One thing I just wanted to ask quickly, we did have a previous episode, again, where we were talking about alfalfa leaf-cutting bees and the kind of conversion to loose cell management. Their concern mostly were diseases like chalk brood. Do we have to worry about those diseases with mason bees?
It's very, very rare that I get chalk brood in any of my nesting trays.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, I've got 13 research sites across the county and a total of about 500 nesting trays out. And it will be an odd year if I got more than maybe 1 or 2 channels that have some mold in it,
uh-huh.
which is chalk brood. And then to clean those out, basically I throw away the cocoons and then use a bleach solution to scrub out the channel to make sure I've killed the mold really well.
Okay, great.
And then rinse it out with water really good so it won't have any residue.
Okay,
in it.
So you're really focusing your cleaning on these mites. Tell us a little bit about how you do that.
I use a dry process. To me, everything that I was reading back when said that when you wanted to clean your cocoons, you would collect them and then you would either put them under running water 2 or 3 different times and shake them around and swish them around in the water.
Oh, so you would
maybe
knock the mites off, presumably.
Yeah, and then you'd put them under running water and then you'd lay them out on a paper towel to dry them. And a number of people recommended using a 5% or higher percent of a bleach solution and swishing your cocoons around in that and then putting them under running water 2 or 3 times to rinse that off and then putting them on a paper towel to dry them again. And it never made sense to me because I went to great lengths all throughout the nesting season to assure that the nesting trays were dry or the straws were dry so that I wouldn't promote mold. So why at the end am I putting these things that I've taken great care to keep dry? Why would I put them through all of this water process? And then there was a entomologist at the University of Victoria that was using a dry sand process where he would get a big plastic jar, put a bunch of cocoons in it, and put in a bunch of beach sand because he lived on an island. And he would swing the jar around, and the sand and the cocoons would be swirling around in this jar.
Mm-hmm.
And it made sense to me that it was a dry process, and I really liked that concept. And I told him that it didn't. If you study the process, it looked like there were a little bit of a problem because the sand and the cocoons were moving at the same speed in the same direction. And it didn't seem like there was much scuffing going on. So I came up with this design where you could use a wire grid cone or cylinder that you would mount into a mason jar, and it's 1/8-inch hardware cloth. So the screen is 1/8 of an inch openings in the screen cylinder that I make. It goes inside of a mason jar. You can put up to 100 cocoons in the cylinder. And it goes down into the middle of a mason jar. You pour in a little Dixie cup full of mason sand, because mason sand has a lot of grit to it, sharp angles. So it helps scuff things really quickly. And then you put the lid on the jar and you turn it sideways and you shake it like a cocktail shaker. And you shake it for about 4 minutes, and the sand is going back and forth through the cylinder. The cocoons are in the cylinder and they can't move very far, so they're pretty protected. And the sand basically scuffs all of the mites off the outside of the cocoons. So if you look at them under a microscope before and afterwards, if you look at them under a microscope, they're pretty much mite-free.
Oh, and this is something anybody can do with a hand lens anyways. You can sort of see the mites on the outside surface. You can tell if it's working. Yeah. Yeah,
if you have a little 10-powered hand lens, it will work fine. And that way, using a dry process, your cocoons never get in contact with moisture, and it seems to be really effective. And then you basically, you have two options with the dirty sand. You can either throw it away because it's got mites in it, or you can bake it in an oven at 250 degrees for 30 minutes. And that'll kill the mites that are in the sand if you want to keep reusing the sand over and over. But you can buy a 5-gallon bucket of sand from a landscape supply place. 5 buckets of mason sand costs you about $3. And for most people, that'll last you several years.
Fantastic. Cheap, easy, and effective. Well, thank you so much for taking time to talk with us today. I really appreciate this, and good luck with the rest of your, the tail end of the mason bee season.
Still a lot of data out there to collect.
Well, keep collecting. Thank you so much for all that you do.
Okay, thanks for doing it.
Thank you so much for listening. The show is produced by Quinn Sinan-Neal, who's a student here at OSU in the New Media Communications program, and the show wouldn't even be possible without the support of the Oregon Legislature, the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, and Western SARE. Show notes with links mentioned on each episode are available on the website, which is at pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's several ways to connect with me. The first one is you can visit the website and leave an episode-specific comment. You can suggest a future guest or topic, or ask a question that could be featured in a future episode. But you can do the same things on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook by visiting the Oregon Bee Project. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next week.